Hi! The subject of the runtime and what configuration variables and files that it uses is pretty complex, so this video is going to try to detangle that subject for you. Here's a list of the places and names of property files that the runtime framework looks for automatically. If you've seen my video about licensing, some of these will look familiar. Now you can put your configuration variables in any of these places and the runtime will pick it up. But the last value of the variable that it reads is the one that it's going to use. The first place it looks is the system environment variables. The next three places, 2, 3, and 4, and then again in 6, it's going to look for a specific file called iscobol.properties in one of these locations. Numbers 5 and 7 are set from the command line, not from within a configuration file. Number 5 is a configuration file named whatever you name it, and then referenced with the -C on the command line, or you can use a more formal -J-D option, like it is here. The last place that you can set a value and override any of the previous settings is on the command line to set the variable itself, using the -J-D iscobol. And then whatever the variable is that you want to set, and then the value. If you set it on the command line, it's going to overwrite everything behind it. So with all of these options, if you want to spread your configuration values over more than one properties file, you can put them in any of these places. But that's pretty limiting and it's pretty inefficient. We have a better way. You can use iscobol.conf.copy inside of your first configuration file to refer to another one, sort of piggybacking them. For instance, these 5 variables on the left in acme.properties are specified in the command line. And in acme.properties, we've set iscobol.conf.copy to reference another configuration file called default.properties. And you can see default.properties on the right. Now notice that both of the properties files set GUI icon file. In the case that you see on the screen, default properties will be set, and at that point the icon file will be abc.bitmap. And then later on it's reset to acme.jpg, so that's the one that the runtime will use. If you change the order of iscobol.conf.copy and the GUI icon file, then it's the other way around. The runtime will find acme.jpg and then it will reset it when it finds the abc.bitmap, and that's the one that it will use. Like I said, you can see that these configuration files and variables are being set in a lot of different places, and it's very complex. And sometimes you just want to override every one of them. Tell the runtime framework, don't look at any of those 7 locations, just use this one. And the way to do that is to use the -C only switch on the command line, or on the command line use the -J-D iscobol.conf.only. However, remember that this properties file needs to contain your license because it's not going to pick your license up in any of the other locations. Now sometimes, before you start a program, you don't know which configuration file you want to use, or maybe what values you want to use. Well, you can set it programmatically using $config. There are 2 opcodes. One is cconfig-reset, and that resets all of the variables back to their original values. And then if you also pass a configuration file in the command, it will then look at that configuration file and set those variables. The other opcode is cconfig-append, and that doesn't reset any of the current values, it just adds a new configuration file. If you want to list the configuration files and the values that the runtime found, you can set a log file to a trace level of 1, as I've done here. And you see an example of it listing all of the places that it looked for a properties file. And I've numbered them in red on the left to show you the order that matches the order that we saw in that first screen. So let's take a look at all of this. First, let's look at the order that the runtime framework reads the config files. I've got the slide here for our reference, and I have a test called config test. I'm going to run it now, and it checks a variable called myvar. Right now, myvar is not set. So we're going to go to number 2 to the etc iscobol properties file, and that's here. And this is where I keep my license usually. But I'm going to set myvar. We'll save that and run it. And you can see that the variable value is the same as it was set here. So let's override that with something farther down. Let's go to number 5, -C, and our own configuration file. I have a config properties where I set my var to this value. And so if I reference it on the command line, there, it overrode the value in etc iscobol properties with the value that we have in our config properties. Now let's override that with number 7. We're going to set my var directly on the command line. And you can see it did override the value that was in config properties. Now, what if I want to override all 3 of those locations that I've set it in by using C only? And we know that if we just run this alone, we're going to pick up the etc iscobol. We want to override that. So we'll use the -C only. And we get an error license because remember, my license is in here and we've just told the runtime framework to ignore this file. So let's go back to I only and I'll uncomment out my license. And we'll try this command again. So it did override the value that was in etc iscobol properties. So that's a little bit about the order of the configurations that are read. Let's look at nesting configuration files. Now I have another program that reads 2 variables, myvar and myvar2. Now here's where we are with those. And myvar is set in config.properties, and myvar2 was not set. So let's go to config.properties again, and here is my setting for iscobol.conf.copy, where I'm bringing in a second properties file, and I called it second properties. So this one sets my var, but when I go to second properties, it will reset my var to this value, and it will set my var2 to hello. So we'll save it and we'll run this again. And there you can see it picked up that second.properties. Now let's take a look at how $config is used. I'm going to run another program called cconfig, and we'll look at 3 properties, myvar, myvar2, and myvar3. I'm going to run it in debug so we can see how $config is used. And I'll type run. And now we're going to see what was set originally from the command line. And you can see down here we have myvar set in second properties, just like we had before. Myvar2 is hello, and myvar3 of course isn't set. We haven't set it yet. Next I want to append or add the values that are found in config-append.properties. Let's take a look at that. So we're resetting myvar2 from hello to good day, and we're setting myvar3 for the first time to the value of 10. Step through there, and now we see that the value of myvar, well, it hasn't changed because remember we didn't reset it. Myvar2 is good day instead of hello, and myvar3 is set to 10. So that's appending. Now let's go to reset, cconfig reset, and here I'm going to reset all 3 of the variables, and then I'm going to set whatever set in config-reset properties. So let's take a look at that. In config-reset properties, I'm setting myvar2 to goodbye, myvar3 to 99, and I'm not setting myvar at all. So let's step through that. And you can see that myvar was reset. It has no value. Myvar2 is goodbye, and myvar3 is 99. And the last thing is using $config and cconfig-reset, but not giving it the name of a configuration file like I did previously. And this will reset the environment back to what it was when the runtime framework started. And they are all blank, but more than blank, they're not set at all. Because remember, when the runtime started, myvar, myvar2, and myvar3 didn't exist. So at this point, because we reset it, it no longer exists. So I've tried to be as comprehensive as possible to show you the complexity of the configuration files and configuration value setting. If you have any questions, as always, we're happy to help you at support@variant.com. Thank you.